I never thought the day I buried my wife of 41 years would also be the day my son told me I had 2 weeks to find somewhere else to live. It happened fast, the way things do when grief hasn't finished with you yet. I was still wearing the dark suit I'd bought for the funeral, the one Marion had always liked on me, said it made me look like a professor, when my son sat me down at the kitchen table of the house I'd owned since 1987 and slid a piece of paper across to me like we were closing a business deal. "We need to talk about next steps," he said. I looked at the paper. It was a printout from a real estate website. A senior living community 40 minutes outside of Indianapolis. My daughter-in-law was standing by the counter, arms folded. Not cruelly, more like she'd already rehearsed what came after and was waiting for her cue. "It's a good place," she said. "They have activities, a pool. I'm 68 years old. I taught high school chemistry for 32 years. I can change a tire, build a bookshelf, and I still do the crossword every morning in pen. I did not need a pool." "I just got back from burying your mother," I said. My son looked at the table. He had the grace to look uncomfortable, at least. "We know, Dad, and we've been here all week, but Denise and I have been talking for a while about the house and my house. You're alone in it now. It's 4 bedrooms. You can't keep up with it." I could, actually. I'd been keeping up with it just fine, same as I always had. Marion had been sick for 2 years, and I had managed the house, managed her care, managed everything right up until the end. But I understood what was really happening. The house was paid off. The house was worth something, and my son had a mortgage on a place in Carmel that I happened to know was tighter than he let on, because Marion had told me, quietly, 6 months before she died, when she was still worried about everyone else, even as her own body was giving out. I sat there for a long moment, looking at my son. This man I had coached in Little League, helped with his algebra, driven to the emergency room at 2 in the morning when he broke his wrist in college, and I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter, a door closing somewhere. 2 weeks, I said. He nodded. He didn't meet my eyes. I folded the paper, put it in my jacket pocket, and went upstairs to sleep in the bedroom Marion and I had shared for 37 years. I didn't sleep much. The next 10 days I spent in a fog. I called a few old friends. Made some calls about the senior community, just to see what we were actually talking about. Shared rooms the size of a graduate student's dorm. No kitchen. An activities calendar with things like gentle yoga and movie Monday. Nothing wrong with any of it, I knew that, but it wasn't where I expected to be at 68, 2 weeks out from my wife's funeral. I kept going back to the house, of course. It was still my house. My son had implied that the 2 weeks was more of a suggestion than a deadline, that he wasn't trying to rush me, that they just wanted me to be safe. But I could feel it, the way the air had changed. My daughter-in-law had already started clearing out some of Marion's things without asking. Just practical things, she said. Just making space. I started driving. I've always driven when I need to think. Marion used to say I'd burned more gas processing my feelings than most men spent in a lifetime. She wasn't wrong. I found myself on the east side of Indianapolis, near the old Riverside neighborhood, in a part of the city I hadn't been to in years. I parked near a stretch of storefronts that had been there since the 70s. A hardware store, a dry cleaner, a pharmacy with one of those old-fashioned lunch counters inside. I used to bring my students here on field trips, back when the neighborhood was being documented as a local history project. I needed coffee, and I needed to sit somewhere that wasn't my house, or my son's house, or the senior community with its pool. The pharmacy lunch counter was quiet, but Tuesday morning, mid-October, the kind of cold that hadn't decided yet if it meant business. I sat on a stool and ordered coffee and a piece of pie I didn't really want, and that's when I noticed the man at the end of the counter. He was older than me, I guessed. Maybe mid-70s, lean, with white hair and a very straight back. He was dressed in a way you didn't see much anymore, not formally, but carefully. A wool cardigan, pressed trousers, good shoes. He had a white cane hooked over the edge of the counter next to him, and he was sitting with both hands wrapped around a coffee mug, facing more or less forward, in the particular way of someone accustomed to navigating a world they couldn't see. I wasn't staring, or I tried not to, but the counter was quiet, and we were the only two people on it, and after a few minutes he spoke without turning his head. "You've been sighing since you sat down," he said. "3 times. I've been counting." I almost laughed. "Sorry. Don't apologize." I was curious, not complaining. He had a deliberate way of speaking. Not slow exactly, more like each sentence was something he'd considered before releasing it. Bad morning or bad decade? "Somewhere in between," I said. He nodded, as though this was a reasonable answer. We were quiet for a moment. The woman behind the counter refilled my coffee without being asked. "You come here often?" I asked. It sounded foolish the moment I said it. "Every Tuesday," he said. "I live 2 blocks over. My caregiver brings me in the morning and picks me up at noon. I have the counter to myself until about 10:30, when the regulars start coming in." He paused. "You're new." "First time in years. I used to know this neighborhood." Most people who say that mean they knew it when it was different. "Maybe," I said, "or maybe I just stopped paying attention." He seemed to consider this. Then he said, "My name is August." "Nolan," I said. I almost reached to shake his hand before I caught myself, but he extended his own hand first, precisely in my direction, and we shook. His grip was firm, deliberate, the same as his speech. "What do you do, Nolan?" he asked. "Retired teacher." "Chemistry." I paused. "What did you do?" "Civil engineering," he said. "Bridges, mostly. I built things meant to last." He said it without pride or performance, just a fact. "I retired 12 years ago when my eyes went. Macular degeneration. It comes for a lot of us." I didn't say I was sorry. Something told me he didn't want that. We talked for another hour. It surprised me. I hadn't really talked to anyone, not properly, since before Marion got sick, and maybe longer than that. We talked about Indianapolis, about the way cities change, about what it costs to build something that holds. He asked about chemistry, and I found myself explaining things I hadn't explained in years, concepts I'd spent decades finding better ways to describe to teenagers. He listened the way smart people listen, actively, occasionally interrupting with a question that showed he'd actually understood. At 20 to 12, a younger man came in. His caregiver, a quiet guy in his 30s who waited near the door without interrupting. August felt for his cane and stood. "Same time next Tuesday?" he said. "I might not be in the area," I said. He paused. "You said you used to know this neighborhood. Maybe it's worth getting to know it again." I thought about that on the drive back. I came back the next Tuesday. The weeks that followed are hard to describe in a way that does them justice. I'd worked out a temporary arrangement. My cousin had a spare room in Bloomington, an hour south, and I was staying there while I figured out what came next. I drove up to Indianapolis on Tuesdays and sometimes Thursdays in August, and I would sit at that lunch counter and talk. He was a private person. I learned things about him slowly and in fragments, the way you learn things about someone who has thought carefully about what he shares. He'd been born and raised in Indiana. He'd studied engineering at Purdue on a scholarship in the early 70s. He'd spent most of his career in infrastructure consulting. Not glamorous work, he said, but important. He'd never married. He had a brother in Arizona who called occasionally and visited less. "No children?" I asked once. "No children," he said. There was no wistfulness in it, just a fact among other facts. I told him about Marion, about how we'd met in our mid-20s, about the life we'd built, about the 2 years of watching her get smaller and smaller until one October morning, she was just gone. He listened without filling the silence with comfort. That was one of the things I appreciated most about him. He didn't rush to make things better. I told him about my son eventually, about the 2 weeks, about the folded piece of paper still in my jacket pocket. He was quiet for a long time. "Did he ask you what you wanted?" he said finally. "No. He drank his coffee. "Grief does strange things to people who can't sit with their own discomfort. Sometimes they manage it by managing you." That sentence stayed with me for a long time. My son called periodically to check in, he said. He asked how I was. He mentioned the senior community again. They had an opening, he said, and it might not last. My daughter-in-law sent me a link to a different facility farther south with better reviews. I thanked her and didn't respond further. I was figuring things out in my own time. For the first time in years, I had the space to do that. In November, something shifted with August. He mentioned offhandedly that he'd had a difficult appointment with his doctor. Not alarming, he said, but worth paying attention to. His heart, the kind of thing that arrives when you're 74 and has to be reckoned with. He came to the counter the next Tuesday and the Tuesday after, but something was different. He was a little slower. The silences between us stretched a little longer. One Thursday, I arrived and he was already there, but he'd gotten turned around coming in. The regular hostess wasn't there, and a new young woman had seated him at a booth instead of the counter, and he was sitting in it with a controlled stillness that I had come to understand meant he was more disoriented than he'd admit. I guided him to the counter, matter-of-factly, without making a production of it, and he thanked me the same way. I should probably not come alone, he said. Your caregiver. He changed his schedule. I've been taking a cab. He paused. I'm more stubborn than is probably sensible. I've noticed. He almost smiled. Nolan, would you be willing to come Tuesdays and Thursdays? I'll pay for your gas. You don't need to pay for my gas. I know I don't need to. I'm asking if you would. I came Tuesdays and Thursdays. It grew from there, the way things grow when they're allowed to. I started picking August up from his apartment 2 blocks away, and afterward I'd drop him back and sometimes come up for coffee before driving back to Bloomington. His apartment was the kind of organized that looks casual but isn't. Everything in a specific place, specific purpose, nothing extra. He'd built systems over the years for navigating without sight that were more elegant than most people's with it. We watched basketball together. Well, I watched and described, and he listened and commented on the strategy with an accuracy that was almost unsettling. He'd been a fan for 50 years. He understood the game in a way that didn't require seeing it. He told me about the bridge he was most proud of. A pedestrian bridge in Columbus, Indiana, built in the 90s. Simple design, he said, but honest, built to carry the weight it was asked to carry, without pretending to be more than it was. He'd driven past it once a year until he couldn't drive anymore, and then he'd had his caregiver take him past it on the way to somewhere else. I haven't been by it in 4 years, he said. We could go, I said. He was quiet. I'd like that. We went the following Saturday. Columbus is an hour south, a small city surprisingly full of architectural landmarks, something August explained to me on the drive with a precision that made me feel like I was attending a very good lecture. We parked and walked to the bridge, and I described it to him the way he'd taught me to describe things. Not impressionistically, but concretely. The color of the metal. The way the rivets were spaced. The slight arc of it. The way the planks sounded underfoot. He stood in the middle of it with one hand on the railing and his face turned slightly up, and I watched him the way you watch someone reading a letter they've been waiting a long time to receive. Still solid, he said. Solid, I agreed. On the drive back, he was quieter than usual. After a while, he said, I want to tell you something. All right. I'd been meeting with my attorney about my estate. He paused. I don't have family who is engaged. My brother is not well. I have no children, as you know. I've accumulated more than I expected to over the years. I'm not a wealthy man in any dramatic sense, but I've been careful and I worked for a long time, and the money is real. I didn't say anything. I wasn't sure what was coming. I've been thinking about what I want to do with it, he said. Not from obligation. From intention. He turned his face toward me in the way he did when he wanted to be sure I was paying attention. You have been more present for me in the last 3 months than anyone has been in years. I don't say that to make you uncomfortable. I say it because it's accurate, and I think you should know it. August. I'm not asking for a response. I'm telling you something. That's different. I drove. The highway was quiet, late on a Saturday afternoon. I'm glad I found that lunch counter, I said finally. Tuesdays, he said. Tuesdays, I said. January was harder. August had a hospital stay in the second week of the month. 3 days, cardiac-related, the kind of thing that gets described as precautionary, but doesn't feel precautionary when you're sitting in a waiting room by yourself. I was there the first day. I brought a book and didn't read it. His brother called from Arizona while August was still admitted. I happened to be in the room when the nurse handed August the phone, and I stepped into the hallway to give them privacy. When I came back 20 minutes later, August handed the phone back to the nurse and said nothing for a while. "He's not coming," he said eventually. I nodded. He asked how bad it was. I told him it wasn't bad. He seemed relieved. A pause. I think the relief was genuine. I stayed until they told me visiting hours were over. He came home 3 days later and insisted he was fine, and he mostly was, but things had shifted. He tired more easily. The Tuesdays and Thursdays were sometimes just an hour instead of 2. Some weeks he didn't want to go out at all, and I'd bring food from the diner in containers and we'd sit in his apartment, and I'd describe whatever game was on while he ate. In March, he told me he'd finalized his will. He told me the broad shape of it, not the numbers, not the specific arrangements, but the fact of it. He'd spoken to his attorney months ago and the paperwork was in order. He'd also, he said, arranged with the hospital where he saw his cardiologist for a donation in the event of his death. He was precise about it in the way he was precise about everything. "You're included," he said. He said it the same way he'd say anything else. Matter of fact. I started to say something. "Don't," he said. "It's already done. I made the decision I wanted to make, and I'm not looking for your approval or your argument. I just wanted you to know." We sat there for a while with the television on mute. "August," I said. You're a strange man." "I know," he said. And this time, he did smile. He died on a Thursday in early April. Not dramatically. He'd been declining through March, and the last 2 weeks I'd been there most days, and one Thursday morning I let myself in with the key he'd given me and found him in his chair, the way you sometimes find people who've been ready. The caregiver called the appropriate people. I sat in the kitchen and drank coffee that tasted like nothing and looked at the specific, deliberate order of his apartment. Every object in its place, every system intact. I called his brother in Arizona because someone had to. The service was small. A colleague from his engineering days, 2 former neighbors, his attorney, a steady woman named Hartwell, whom I'd spoken to once on the phone. I spoke briefly because I was asked to, and I talked about the bridge in Columbus and about Tuesdays and about the way he described things, with precision, without pretension. I didn't cry until I was in the car afterward, and then I did for a while. The call from attorney Hartwell came 6 weeks later. I knew a conversation was coming. August had been clear that I was included, but I hadn't known the specifics, and specifics I was learning matter. She was measured and professional on the phone. She explained that August had been thoughtful and deliberate in his planning, which matched everything I knew about him. She said the estate was more substantial than I'd realized. He'd been precise about calling himself not wealthy in any dramatic sense, but the house he'd owned in Indianapolis, sold 5 years ago when he moved to the apartment, plus investments accumulated over 4 decades of careful living, had added up to something real. He had left the majority of it to me. I'm not going to tell you what the number was, because it doesn't matter to the story the way you might expect it to. What mattered was sitting at my kitchen table in Bloomington, my cousin's kitchen table technically, holding the phone, listening to Hartwell explain that August had left instructions about several things: the hospital donation, a small amount to his former employer's scholarship fund at Purdue, and the remainder, clearly and legally and with proper documentation, to me. "He executed this last November," Hartwell said. "He was thorough. I handled the documentation personally. There's nothing ambiguous about his intentions." I thanked her and sat for a long time without moving. I called my cousin in the next room and told her what had happened. She cried. I made us both tea. My son called me the following week. I don't know if word had gotten to him somehow, or if it was just coincidence. One of his periodic check-ins that had become less frequent as it became clear I wasn't going to run out of options and appear on his doorstep. "How are you doing?" he said. "Better," I said. "Honest, are you still up in Bloomington?" "For now." A pause. "Dad, I just want to say, I know things were rough right after Mom died, and I feel like maybe we handled some of that badly. Denise and I both agree that we could have." "You don't need to do this," I said. Not unkindly. "I know, but I know you do," I said. "I appreciate it. I really do." There was a silence between us that wasn't comfortable exactly, but wasn't hostile either. Just the truth of it sitting there in the air. "Are you all right for money?" he said. "Because if you need—" "I'm all right," I said. The conversation ended shortly after. We still talk, less than we used to, more than we did in those first months. My daughter-in-law sends me links to articles sometimes, gardening things or crossword apps she thinks I'd like, and I thank her and usually look at them. People are complicated. My son is complicated. I loved him as a boy, and I love him now. And that doesn't mean I've forgotten the piece of paper slid across the kitchen table. Some things you put down. Some things you carry different. I moved back to Indianapolis in the summer, not to the house. My son had been right about one thing, which is that 4 bedrooms alone doesn't make sense. I found a place on the east side of the city, not far from that pharmacy lunch counter, a small house with a good kitchen and a yard that needs work, but not more work than I want to give it. Tuesdays I go to the counter. I sit on the stool at the end, where August used to sit. I've gotten to know the woman who works it, and the regulars who come in around 10:30. I've told a few of them about August, about who he was, what he built, how he talked. They listen. People generally like to hear about someone who lived well. I drove down to Columbus in September, parked and walked to the bridge, and stood in the middle of it with one hand on the railing. Still solid. I thought about what he'd said that day in the car on the way back, about intention versus obligation, about making decisions from a clear place, not from what you owe or what you're afraid of. I've been thinking about it ever since. Marion always said I burned too much gas driving around, processing. She wasn't wrong. But some things only become clear when you're in motion, when you're covering ground, when you let yourself just move through the world without a destination for a while. I lost my wife. I was walked to the edge of something by my own son and left there. And then I sat down on a lunch counter stool next to a blind man who'd spent his life building things to carry weight, and somehow that became the foundation of whatever this next part is. I don't know what to call it. I'm not sure I need to. What I know is this. Some people come into your life because the world arranges it that way. Because you happen to be in the same place at the same time on a Tuesday morning when you're both just a little lost and just a little braver than you expected. And what you build between you out of coffee and conversation and Tuesdays and the small act of showing up turns out to hold. August built bridges. He knew better than most people what it takes. I think about him every time I cross one.